ඔබේ තිස කෙස්වලත් ආරක්ෂාව වෙනුවෙන්ම ලයිෆ් බොයි ඩබල් සැෂේ දැන් රුපියල් 10ක් පමණයි.
පේරාදෙණිය විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයෙන් මූලික වෛද්‍ය උපාධිය ලබාගත් ශ්‍රී ලාංකික විද්‍යාඥයෙක් වන මහාචාර්ය මලික් පීරිස් මහතා අද වන විට ලෝකයේ වෛරස් වේදය පිළිබඳ විද්‍යාඥයින් අතර ප්‍රමුඛ ස්ථානයක් හිමිකර ගැනීමට සමත්ව තිබෙන විද්‍යාඥයෙක් වනවා. ලොව පිළිගත් විද්‍යාත්මක සංගරා සඳහා පර්යේෂණ පත්‍රිකා 600කට අධික සංඛ්‍යාවක් ප්‍රකාශයට පත් කර ඇති මහාචාර්ය මලික් පීරිස් මහතා ලොව ප්‍රමුඛ පෙළේ විද්‍යාඥයින්ගෙන් සැඳුම්ලත් බ්‍රිතාන්‍යයේ රාජකීය සමාජයේද සමාජිකයෙක්. 2003 වසරේදී පැතිර ගිය SARS වෛරසය හඳුනා ගැනීම සහ එම වසංගතය පාලනය කිරීම සඳහා මහාචාර්ය මලික් පීරිස් මහතා සිදු කළ කාර්යභාරය ලොව පුරා විද්‍යාඥයින්ගේ පැසසුමට ලක් වූ අතර ඔහු 2015 වසරේ මැද පෙරදිග කලාපයේ පැතිර ගිය MERS වෛරසය සම්බන්ධයෙන් කෙරුණු පර්යේෂණ සඳහාද සුවිශේෂී දායකත්වයක් ලබා දුන්නා. ඔහු වර්තමානයේදී හොංකොං විශ්වවිද්‍යාලයේ සමාජ සෞඛ්‍ය පිළිබඳ විද්‍යායතනයේ වෛරස් අධ්‍යයන විද්‍යාව පිළිබඳ අංශයේ ප්‍රධානියා ලෙස කටයුතු කරන අතර මේ දිනවල ශ්‍රී ලංකාවට පැමිණ සිටිනේ මහතා පසුගියදා ලංකා කායික රෝග විශේෂඥවරුන්ගේ සංගමය සංවිධානය කර තිබූ සාකච්ඡාවකට එක් වුණා.
This new disease has created a huge amount of fear, uncertainty, and anxiety among the general public. The false science and myths created around the virus and propagated on social media have made things worse. Today, to address these issues and to educate us on the science behind COVID-19, we have with us a world-renowned expert on the subject, Professor Malik Peiris. On behalf of the Ceylon College of Physicians, I welcome you to this program.
Now, in terms of transmission, it is also important to understand that most of the transmission takes place, or it's estimated that about 44% of transmission from one person to another takes place before the person has symptoms. And then after that, within the next 3 or 4 days, there is transmission. But after day 5, day 6, day 7, as you can see from that graph, the extent of transmission very rapidly decline.
Let's move on to how to diagnose COVID-19. PCR is the test that we are most familiar with. How does PCR work and what are the limitations of this test?
So if we just compare RT-PCR and the antigen test, PCR is associated with amplifying the virus nucleic acid. The sensitivity is quite high. But then if you correlate it with infectious virus, because infectious virus is associated with quite high virus load in the patient specimens, then the correlation with PCR is low. In other words, not every person, not every test of PCR positive means that the person is having infectious virus. Because the antigen test is somewhat less sensitive than PCR, it picks up those patients with high viral load. So the correlation of the antigen test with infectiousness is much better. The antigen test, some of the early versions of these antigen tests were not very good. But the more recent ones, particularly the ones that have been approved by WHO, are much better. So I think we need to be able to use both of these for the right purposes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about when and on whom these tests should be used?
Because of the sensitivity of PCR, if you have a patient who is sick, who you want to diagnose, then PCR is probably the method of choice. Having said that, if you really want to make a very quick decision and the nearest PCR is 50 miles away, and the antigen test may give you a faster result. So you have to judge that. On the other hand, when you are trying to control transmission and you are trying to identify people who are most infectious, for that purpose, the antigen test would be quite satisfactory because that test is rapid, but also will pick up the most infectious patients.
It is possible to be PCR positive but not be infective to others. Can you explain this?
Right. So as I said before, the PCR test detects not the whole virus particle, not the infectious virus particle, but the virus genetic material. So the genetic material of the virus can remain present for quite a long time after the virus is no longer infectious. So because of that, now WHO has changed its recommendations and basically says that for asymptomatic and mild patients, after 8 to 9 to 10 days, the patient is not infectious. So you don't even have to do a PCR because the PCR may be positive, but that does not necessarily mean that the patient is infectious. I showed that from the epidemiological, the contact tracing studies, it's very clear that by day 5, day 6, after onset of symptoms, there is no further transmission.
Lever Ayush. කහ සබන් සඳක් වගේ බබලන පිවිතුරු සමකට